you are happy unless you convince yourself otherwise. I've recently read the book Don't Believe Everything You Think, and it proposes a very interesting idea. And the idea is that we suffer when we are thinking, and we think ourselves into suffering. And essentially, we think ourselves out of happiness. And I believe that is true. I I looked into my life and I realized all the times I was ever unhappy, I was thinking. Now, in the book, he claims that if you are thinking, you cannot be happy. And I disagree with that. But I did notice if I was suffering, I was thinking. And thinking is different than thoughts. You know, thoughts are the things that just come to you randomly. And then thinking is when you elaborate on those thoughts. You know, so you have a thought to travel the world, and then you think about it and you think, oh, that's not logical. I shouldn't do that, or I can't do that. The thinking is causing your suffering. The thought was a divine thought that you didn't control because it just came out of nowhere. But your thinking, you do control. And that is when you tell yourself you can't do it. And that's when you're negative, and that's when you ruin your happiness. You know, Alan Watts said, you're in nirvana as long as you don't object. And I think it's the same thing. You know, I believe I've been thinking myself out of happiness for a long time, and I believe a lot of people do. And I don't think thinking is necessarily bad, but I think it's good to realize that if you are suffering, you must be thinking. And I know there's physical suffering and, you know, things of that nature, but on a completely mental and like metaphysical sense, you know, if you are suffering, you are thinking. And it's a very profound realization, I believe. And I believe our natural state is to be happy. You know, when we're not thinking, when we're just going through, enjoying the moment, living in the present, we're happy. But then we go out and try to convince ourselves that we're not happy. And it's interesting that we do that. Very, very interesting. Now, I'll just give a personal example because that's all I can really give. But recently, I've been very not happy. And I realized that I was bringing that upon myself, that I actually was happy. But the reason I was going through this time where I felt like I was depressed and wasn't happy was because I was convincing myself I wasn't happy. And long story short, there's a decision that I want to make. And I think subconsciously, to give myself the courage to make the decision, I had to try to convince myself that I wasn't happy. You know, I had to tell myself, no, this thing is making you depressed. This thing is destroying your well being. This thing is causing you pain. This thing is doing all these things. And I had to convince myself that this thing was the reason I was unhappy. But I wasn't unhappy. I had to convince myself to, I quit my job, essentially. I had to convince myself that I should quit my job by convincing myself that I wasn't happy because I didn't have the courage just to do it. And that's a horrible thing because I did convince myself. But recently, after reading that book and thinking about it, I am happy. I am extremely happy. But the only times I'm not is when I try to convince myself that I'm not happy. And I think to a certain degree, we all do this. And I think we all need to get to a place where we can realize that we need to change and we need to grow constantly because that's just the nature of the universe. Everything is changing, everything is in constant flux, and we are not, we are in that cycle. And we need to realize that. And we need to realize that it's not a bad thing. And it's just because we're giving up what we used to do doesn't mean that thing is horrible. It doesn't mean the whole time we were doing it, we were wrong. We were unhappy. We were doing something that was against our nature. That's not what that means at all. It was part of our path, and we went through it for a reason. And it's okay that we were happy. But now, our soul, the still small voice, the internal guidance system we have is now telling us to not do that anymore. It's telling us, hey, that served its purpose, but now you got to go to this stage in life. And there was nothing wrong with this stage. You don't have to convince yourself you're unhappy. You don't have to convince yourself that it was bad. But it is time. You've grown. It's time for you to change and change into this. It's kind of a weird example, but an acorn, when the oak tree or when the acorn finally becomes an oak tree, it doesn't look back at when it was an acorn and say, how stupid was I? How pitiful of a thing I was, a mere acorn when I could have been an oak tree this whole time. It doesn't say that. I mean, it doesn't say anything, but you know what I'm saying. Um, it understands, or at least we understand, that to become the oak tree, it had to be the acorn. It couldn't just come into existence as an oak tree. It had to go through that stage to be an oak tree. And maybe at its full grown, oak tree, maybe that's its peak performance. Maybe that's its peak, its peak. But it doesn't mean that the state of the acorn was bad. It doesn't mean that it had to be unhappy when it was an acorn. It doesn't mean that it has to shun everything it ever did because it wasn't where it is now. The acorn was part of the oak tree's path, and it needed to be an acorn to become an oak tree. And you need where you are right now to get where you're going. And there's nothing wrong with being happy where you are, but changing. There's nothing wrong with being content where you are, but understanding that something inside of you wants something different. Maybe not even something more, but it can be. But it can just something different. Realizing that you've walked this path to the end of its road, and instead of turning around and redoing it, go to a different path. It served its purpose. You don't have to convince yourself when you get to the end of the path, oh my gosh, I've wasted so much time. I'm so depressed. I'm so unhappy. I need to get out of this. I need to go to that. You can just say, okay, that season in my life is over. That chapter in my life is over. Now it's time to go to the next chapter. It's time to go to the next season. And there was nothing wrong with the last season. I couldn't get to this path without going down that path. It's like you need to get to the peak to see the other peaks. All you can see in front of you is one peak. But then when you get to the next one, you can see maybe multiple peaks or maybe just one more peak. But, you can't see that stuff when the peak is in front of you and it's all you can see. You have to walk that path to get realizations, to grow, to change, to understand. And the point I'm really trying to make here is just that we don't have to, when we get to the end of the path, like I was saying, we don't have to convince ourselves that we're unhappy or that we were unhappy or that everything we've ever done was a waste of time and that we should have been doing this from the beginning. Because that's not how it works. You can't just leap over things. An oak tree cannot just come into an existence. A butterfly does not just come into existence. It has to be a caterpillar first. The oak tree has to be an acorn first. So don't shun the places you've been and don't shun where you are. It's serving a purpose in your development. But if you're at a time on the path and you believe it's time for a different path, that's okay. It's okay to go a different route and say, I was happy. I am happy. But now I want to do something else. This is my one life. I'm going to die. And something inside of me is telling me to do this. I don't want to regret not listening to that. So I'm going to go and try something out. I'm not saying that this is unbearable. I'm not saying that I'm unhappy. I just need something different. Because I think after a while, the unlived life will make you ill. But at the end of the day, I think it's all mental as well. And I think our natural state is happiness. And as long as we don't sit here and try to convince ourselves we are not happy, we are happy. As long as we don't tell ourselves this sucks, it doesn't suck. And from my experience, I was doing it because I was weak. I didn't have enough courage, or I didn't think I had enough courage to just take that leap without convincing myself where I was completely and utterly unbearable and completely and utterly horrible and a waste of time, a life, everything. But I realized now that it wasn't and it isn't. But it is my time to change. I've changed a lot throughout my life, as everyone should. But even, from a couple of years ago, I've changed a lot. And if I spent a day today like I spent a day 3 or 4 years ago, I would I would beat myself up so much. So much. I would, chastise myself for, wasting time, giving into pleasures and vices that I should not be giving into, and just wasting time and just doing things I don't think I should be doing. But it always amazed me as I look back and I thought, how was I happy? I think if I spent today like I spent a day 4 years ago, I would not be happy today because I'd be thinking so much about how I'm wasting my time, how I'm not doing the right things. But then it amazed me because I was happy. And I was like, how was I happy back then? Doing all these things that don't align with my values. How was I happy? And I realized now I was happy because I wasn't thinking. I was just in the moment. I was just, acting my age. I was just living life. I wasn't thinking. I didn't spend a lot of time thinking back in the day. And I think that led to happiness. I led a simple existence, and I still do, but a lot more simple back then. But I was happy. And it always amazed me how I was. I I could never understand how or why, but now I do, and it's because I was never thinking. I was unhappy. I never thought. I never would convince myself I wasn't happy. I enjoyed how I spent the day. I enjoyed the things I did. I lived in the moment. I lived in the present, and I was happy. It's only now that I think I'm unhappy and I try convincing myself I'm unhappy that I can spend a day in such a better, such a wiser, such a more productive way, but convince myself that I am unhappy. And the only thing doing that is thinking. Marcus Aurelius says, life is but what we deem it to be. And I believe that's true. And as I said, I believe our natural state is happiness. And we're only unhappy when we convince ourselves we're not. And I'm still a novice to this idea. But like I said, I don't think thinking equals unhappiness. But I think unhappiness equals thinking. If you are unhappy, you have to be thinking. But if you're thinking, you don't have to be unhappy. But it's good to remember if you're in a state of, unhappiness, that you may just be thinking too much. And, you should look into that and be like, why? Why why am I convincing myself I'm unhappy right now? Like, what is so bad about this moment? What is so unbearable about the present moment? The present moment is never unbearable. Never. It is only when we add the future to the present, or the past to the present, but mostly the future, that we think it's unbearable, that we convince ourselves that we cannot bear this. We say, I can't do it. But it's funny because as we say, I can no longer bear this, we are actively bearing. You just need to take smaller bites. You don't need to imagine this feeling lasting for hours, days, months, years. Just imagine it, just imagine enduring it for one more second, and then one more, and then one more, and then one more. I was going on a hike a while ago, and I hadn't gone on a hike in a while. I was like the heaviest I'd been in a long time, and I had like 30 pounds on my back because we were camping, and we had to hike like 12 miles, and with like 5,000 elevation gain or something. So it was a healthy hike. And like 2 miles in, I am smoked. And I got to the top. I got to the top. And 2 miles in, I felt like I couldn't go any longer. And you know how I got through those 10 miles? I literally looked at my feet and I said, one. You can always go one more step. One, one. And I just said one as I stepped. One, one, one. And I did that for 10 miles. Obviously, not, every single step, but like whenever it got hard and because you could like see the peak this whole hike. It was in Death Valley, and we had to park, so we had to walk on the road. I think it was like Mount Perry. And so, you're on the road, and you got to go like this way, and then you got to hike up this ridge, and here's the mountain. So, we're right here, and you can see the mountain the whole hike. 2 miles in, not even like right when you start, you could see it. But, when I was 2 miles in and thought, I can't do this anymore, and I would look to my right and I would see where I had to end up, it was unbearable. But when I kept my head down and focused on the next step, it was bearable. The present moment is never unbearable, as long as you don't add the future to it. But yeah, just stop convincing yourself you're unhappy. You're happy. It's our natural state. Life is beautiful. Life is amazing. And just because you're not where you want to be doesn't mean you have to despair. The journey is what life is all about. And don't, just because you're an acorn right now, don't despair that you're not an oak. Realize that if you want to become an oak tree, an acorn is exactly what you have to be. If you want to get to some destination in your life and you're at the start of the path, you're right where you need to be. Yeah, it might be far away. Yeah, there might be a lot of work that has to go into it, but just focus on your next step. And don't convince yourself you're unhappy when you need to change. When you need to adjust your course a little bit, don't say, oh, I'm so unhappy, I'm depressed, I need to do this. Like, no, I'm okay here. This is fine, but I need to change. I need something different. I need to walk this different path. And there's nothing wrong with this path. It's just not my path anymore. I've walked it to its end. And maybe you're with someone else and the path for them goes on a little longer. You say, that's okay, man. Like, this isn't the wrong path. It's just not my path. There's nothing wrong with that. You don't need to convince them they're on the wrong path, and you don't need to convince yourself that all that was wasted time. Because who you are today is just an accumulation of who you've been and what you've done. You can't say, oh, I wish I was like this 10 years ago. That's impossible. You had 10 years of experience to become who you are, the realizations you've gained, whether that's what not to do or what to do. You can't just, jump ahead and become this thing out of nothing. I urge you guys with this message to stop objecting to your happiness. Allow yourself to be happy. It is your natural state. If you're happy and you're, just enjoying a book on a, Saturday afternoon, don't sit there and start convincing yourself you're unhappy because you haven't started your business yet, or you haven't done this, or you haven't done that. Just, enjoy the moment. Enjoy the book. Enjoy where you are. It's all part of a process to where you're going. And yes, sometimes you need to sacrifice and suffer to, get where you want to go. And you got to say, no, I'm not reading today. I need to actually I need to do something. I need to go build whatever, do whatever to get to this outcome. Yeah, sometimes you have to do that. A lot of times you have to do that. But you don't have to convince yourself that you're unhappy to do it. You really don't. And if happiness is your true goal, and I said happiness a lot in this video, but I've said it before, but if this is like first time watching my videos, or um yeah, I mean, happiness and peace are the same thing to me. We disrupt our peace. We convince ourselves we're not at peace inside. So anytime I said happiness in this video, just um, you can say happiness or peace. They're the same thing to me. Peace is a better definition for happiness, but happiness is just easier. It's gets the point across more. I think sounds better. I don't know, but to me, they're the same thing. But yeah, just enjoy your natural state of happiness or peace. Don't convince yourself you're not at peace or happy.